Paul Cézanne was a French post-impressionist painter whose work is said to form the bridge between Impressionism and Cubism. His art, which was misunderstood and discredited by the public during most of his life, grew out of Impressionism and eventually challenged the values of painting in the 19th century. Cézanne produced around 900 oil paintings and 400 watercolors in his lifetime, including more than 30 self-portraits. Paul Cézanne was born in 1839, in Aix-en-Provence, in the south of France. His father was the co-founder of a banking firm that prospered throughout the artist's life, giving him some security. He was, however, constantly in fear that his father would withdraw his financial support, which created ongoing tensions in their relationship. In 1852, 13-year-old Cézanne entered the Collège Bourbon in Aix as a boarder, where he received a traditional and religious education. The boy was withdrawn and shy. Cézanne met Émile Zola at the school, soon after they started there. The pair became close friends and frequently went for walks in the Aix countryside together. Zola, who would later become a famous French writer, was an impoverished outsider in Aix, whereas Cézanne came from a wealthy and influential family. Cézanne protected the younger Zola at the school, but years later the roles reversed. The writer became successful and prosperous, while the painter rarely sold a canvas. After finishing secondary school, Cézanne studied at the law school of the University of Aix, in an effort to please his father. He also took lessons in drawing at the Municipal Art School, where he was awarded second prize for drawing in his last year at the school. Cézanne had a complicated personality. He was considered a bit odd by fellow townspeople, and he was known as a loner. In 1859, Cézanne's father bought a large working farm on the outskirts of the city of Aix. The property, known as Jardin de Buffon, became the center for the artist's early painting experiments. The mansion itself was very run down, but with it came a farmhouse and 37 acres of land, mostly profitable vineyards. In 1861, finding the law totally boring, 22-year-old Cézanne decided to become an artist and to move to Paris. Earlier, his friend Zola, whom he missed dreadfully, had left Aix for Paris, and Cézanne planned to join him there. Cézanne's father's fondest dream was that his son should succeed him at the bank and build the firm into a family business. He considered art as a profession grossly impractical, but his wife managed to convince her husband to give Paul his approval, as well as 100 francs a month to live on. The average wage in French industry at that time was 60 francs per month, so perhaps his father was being generous. In the late 19th century, Paris was in its artistic prime. A colony of artists lived in the city, and art schools formed around some of the finest painters of the times. Artists from all over the world flocked there to exhibit their works in numerous salons and expositions, and to make a name for themselves. Cézanne's first stay in Paris in 1861 lasted just 5 months. He failed to pass the entrance examinations for the Paris School of Fine Arts, when the examiner reported that Cézanne painted like a madman. He enrolled instead at the Académie Suisse, which was not a teaching institution, but simply a collective studio where, for a small fee, artists could work from a live model. Some students visited the morgue, just a few meters away from the Suisse's door. Here, they could observe the anatomy of fresh corpses at no cost whatsoever. Cézanne became severely depressed when he found that he was not as technically proficient as some of his fellow students. He was, after all, virtually untrained and unfamiliar with historic masterpieces of art. He stayed as long as he did, only because of the continuing encouragement of his friend, Zola. Finally, feeling dejected, Cézanne returned to Aix to make a new attempt to work at his father's bank. After a year of boredom, he rejected a legal and banking career altogether. His father finally had to accept that his son was not suited to a commercial career, and agreed to continue his financial support for the artist. Cézanne returned to Paris determined to stay. On his earlier visit to Paris, Cézanne had become friendly with the Impressionist Camille Pissarro at the Académie Suisse, where they both painted. Both men were unconventional, and neither had received a traditional artistic training. Initially, the relationship was that of master and apprentice, in which the older Pissarro exerted a strong influence on the younger artist. As a newcomer to the Paris art scene, Cézanne frequented the Salon, studied the old masters, and copied paintings at the Louvre. He and Pissarro sometimes attended Café Gerbois, a meeting place for bohemian artists, writers and art lovers. Many of the members who met there were Impressionists. Cézanne was interested in their painting style, but his friendship with them was inhibited by his touchiness and deliberate rudeness. He eventually established an amiable relationship with a few, including Whistler, Degas, and Renoir, all of whom were also starting out. Cézanne met Édouard Manet, who was a friend of Émile Zola, in 1864. He even visited his studio. But, as much as he admired his work, he didn't take to the artist. He found this middle-class Parisian too polished, too quick-witted, too elegant. Manet, in turn, considered the young artist from Aix, with his heavy provincial accent, as an overly nervous, quick-tempered boor from the country. Cézanne had indeed developed a suspicious attitude towards other people, believing that they might try to steal his ideas about art. In later years the feeling eventually became so morbid that he could not bear to be near other people. The Paris Salon was the official art exhibition of the Académie of Fine Arts in Paris. At the time, the Salon was arguably the greatest annual art event in the Western world. By the early 1860s, conflict between the realist painters and the official Academy had reached its height. The Academy rejected from its annual exhibition, and therefore from public acceptance, all paintings not in the academic, neoclassical or romantic styles. At that time, an artist could only reach the general public through the Salon. One-man exhibitions and independent group shows were unheard of, and even art dealers were virtually non-existent. In 1863, the French emperor demanded the opening of a Salon des Refusés to counter the growing anger in artistic circles over painters refused by the Salon. These artists included the young Impressionists, who were considered revolutionary at the time. Most of them were only in their 20s and were just forming their styles. Cézanne exhibited paintings in the first exhibition in 1863. He had also tried to exhibit at the Salon, but was rejected because of the unacceptable style of his work. In 1866, he was so exasperated by the Salon's rejection of two of his canvases that he wrote letters of protest to the selection committee questioning the jury's authority. These protests fell on deaf ears, and the authorities turned down his request that the public be allowed to judge for themselves. By the mid-1860s, Cézanne had managed to establish himself as a painter, though with little official success. His comparatively radical painting style excluded him from entry into the School of Fine Arts, and from Salon exhibitions. Cézanne's painting style wavered between violent romanticism and the more analytic attitudes of his contemporaries. He believed that only temperament could propel an artist. His special notion of temperament was quite out of keeping with the spirit of his youthful colleagues. Cézanne's painting, Scipio, shown here, is typical of his early style. It was bought by the Impressionist, Claude Monet, who eventually owned 13 other works by Cézanne. Monet considered this painting to be a work of the greatest strength. During this period, Cézanne's style was violent and dark. He painted scenes with harsh extremes of light and shadow, and with looseness and vigor. They include several erotic and violent subjects, such as the murder, shown here, which depicts a man stabbing a woman, who is held down by his female accomplice. Another is the rape. In these paintings, Cézanne appears to be casting out the demons of his ongoing and difficult relationship with his family, and indulging his early fascination with themes from romantic fiction. It was not just the subject matter, but the way they are painted that gives these paintings their emotional impact. The atmosphere is one of a fever, or a nightmare. Even when Cézanne tackled less emotionally charged subjects, he often produced a feeling of extreme unease. This painting, The Picnic, is an example, where a gathering of strange individuals meet for a picnic. Cézanne is thought to have painted himself into the picture as the bearded man in the foreground. At a time when picnics were a favored theme for artists, and were represented as a refreshment of the senses through light, air and informal play, this picture gives some idea of how much Cézanne's mood differed from his contemporaries. In this picture, the Cézanne character is not taking part in the freedom and cheerfulness of his friends. He is the odd man at the party, the one without the company of a woman, and the only one in formal dress. He seems unable to enjoy the innocence of the occasion. It appears to be full of mystery and doubts for him. At this time, Cézanne was painting with dramatic tonal contrasts and thick layers of paint. The vigor of his style is especially apparent in the 9-portrait series of his uncle Dominique Aubert. The 49-year-old bailiff indulged his nephew with multiple sittings, and agreed to pose in various costumes. In these paintings, Cézanne worked quickly, using both a brush and a palette knife, and applied paint almost as if it were plaster. The resulting works are not only images but also three-dimensional objects. In the same vein, Cézanne explored his emotionally charged relationship with his father in this painting, The Artist's Father. The unyielding figure of Louis-Auguste Cézanne, the newspaper he is reading, his chair, and the room are rendered in thick slabs of paint. 6 years later, he painted the same subject again. The newspaper, the event, that his father is reading, is Cézanne's hidden reference to his friend, novelist Émile Zola, who became the art critic for that newspaper in 1866. Cézanne's father would normally never read such a journal. Zola, who had detailed knowledge of Cézanne's family, had a very poor opinion of Cézanne's father. In one of his books, he mocks him through one of his characters, referring to him as middle-class, stingy and garrulous. Years later, in 1882, and with the help of a friend, Cézanne exhibited this picture at the Paris Salon. He was only able to do so because the other artist claimed that Cézanne was one of his students, and so, according to the rules of the Salon, was entitled to exhibit alongside his master. This was to be his first and only successful submission to the Salon. In 1869, Cézanne met Hortense Ficquet, the woman who became his mistress and later his wife. The pair met at the Académie Suisse, where artists gathered to talk and to paint the models who worked there. She was 19, he was 11 years older. Ficquet's day job was as a bookseller or bookbinder, but she combined this with part-time work as a model to make ends meet. After a while, the pair started a relationship and began to live together in Paris, without his father's knowledge. A year later, Cézanne and Hortense left Paris for L'Estaque, a small village on the coast of southern France, not far from Marseille. They moved, partly to avoid Cézanne being drafted into the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, but also as a refuge from his father's ongoing interference in his life. The cottage they lived in was made available thanks to Cézanne's mother. She paid the rent. And she knew about Hortense, and shared her son's belief that it was important to keep Cézanne's father from finding out that his son was now living with some girl he had met in Paris. Cézanne divided his time between painting scenes of the village and the harbor, and working in the little studio he had established for himself. He also spent days at a time at his family's estate in nearby Aix, leaving Hortense in L'Estaque by herself. While in L'Estaque, Cézanne began to paint his subjects in the same way his Impressionist friends did. Two landscapes from this time, snow at L'Estaque and the Paris wine market, illustrate his technique. The compositions reflects his early style, but it is already more disciplined and more attentive to the atmospheric, rather than the dramatic quality of the light. This work was completed after the pair returned to Paris, where they settled in rooms of their own near the wine market. As you can see, the scene, with the exception of a few red kegs, is uniformly brown and grey. Its leaden sky showing the dreariness of a winter morning, and perhaps Cézanne's sombre mood in those uncertain times. After the birth of their son Paul in 1872, and at the suggestion of his friend Camille Pissarro, Cézanne and his family moved to Auvers, north of Paris. Cézanne's mother knew about baby Paul, but his father was kept in the dark for fear of risking his wrath. Cézanne was totally dependent on his monthly allowance, as his paintings were not selling. He went to great lengths to conceal his relationship with Hortense, and the existence of their child was kept from Louis Auguste for years to avoid any confrontation regarding finances. In Auvers, Pissarro introduced Cézanne to the eccentric, but good-hearted, Dr. Paul Gachet, who was an amateur artist, passionate art collector and an admirer of Pissarro's work. Gachet became Cézanne's first patron, buying several of his still lifes of flowers and fruit. Gachet also helped Cézanne out with his bills, by persuading the local grocer to accept paintings from Cézanne instead of cash. Cézanne rented a tiny place in an alleyway, 2 steps from Dr. Gachet's house, for 100 francs a year. In spite of its small size, the dwelling was sufficient, as he planned to spend most of his time painting out of doors. Nobody knows his wife's feelings on the matter. The couple spent 2 years living there, in the simple village of unpaved country lanes and thatched cottages, where Cézanne listened and watched Pissarro. He lightened his palette, and explored putting large masses of color on the canvas. And he learned to paint more slowly. The picturesque cottages of Auvers, the chimneys, roof edges, trees, hills, and dusty paths, were perfect subjects for the artist. It was through his close working relationship with Pissarro that Cézanne developed both his enduring interest in plein-air painting and a style in many ways similar to that of the Impressionists. Cézanne frequently worked with Pissarro, and together they would draw and paint the local landscape around Pontoise. The two artists would take their canvases all over the countryside, painting out of doors, a technique that was still considered radical at the time. In a letter to his son, Pissarro described how he and Cézanne influenced each other's work at the time. "What is striking," he said, "is the compatibility between landscapes he painted in Pontoise and mine. We were inseparable. But one thing is certain, each of us retained the only thing that matters, our sense of feeling." The differences in Pissarro and Cézanne's sense of feeling was most obvious when they painted the same scene. An example is this picture, which Cézanne borrowed from Pissarro to copy. The original, shown here, shows the beauty of a sunlit autumn day in the countryside. Cézanne's version of the painting is stripped of superficial detail, with a hard coldness, not present in Pissarro's canvas. Cézanne did not usually paint human figures in his landscapes, but in his version of the painting, he kept Pissarro's figure of a woman and small girl walking towards the village. Cézanne had never been at ease with the basics of Impressionism, which in his opinion, lacked structure and form. "I want to make of Impressionism something solid and lasting, like the art in the museums," he said. The artist's different styles are even more evident in the orchard, Pontoise, painted in the spring of 1877. Pissarro's garden is a delicate, shimmering vista of fruit trees in blossom. White and pale green brush strokes almost hide the houses on the hill behind the trees. Cézanne merely hints at the fruit trees. He is far more interested in the heavier substance of walls with their parallel lines, and of a grey slate roof. The ploughed earth of the foreground is rendered in horizontal strips of colour. Cézanne's mature works show a solidified, almost architectural style of painting. Over time, Pissarro persuaded Cézanne to lighten his colours, and showed him the advantages of using the broken bits of colour and short brushstrokes that were the trademark of the Impressionists, which Cézanne came to use regularly, although with a different effect, in his later work. Though Cézanne and Pissarro's styles eventually diverged beyond compatibility, Pissarro never ceased admiring Cézanne's work, which he called truly extraordinary in its savagery and character. In January 1874, Cézanne, Hortense, and their 2-year-old son travelled back to Paris to take part in an exhibition he had heard about while in the South. 30 artists, known as the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors and Engravers, were planning to stage the first independent exhibition of Impressionist art in Paris. The organizers included Degas, Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro. Cézanne wanted to submit this painting, which unfortunately, nobody liked. A modern Olympia is modeled on Manet's earlier painting called Olympia. The organizing committee, with Pissarro's insistence, finally decided that they could not exclude him from their first official Impressionist event, and Cézanne was allowed to enter. He exhibited 3 pictures at the show, including this. He also showed The Hanged Man's House. The exhibition displayed 165 works by 30 artists, but the event was a financial failure. Although 3,500 people came, each paying 1 franc to enter, most attended to sneer and scoff at the works on display, and the newspaper critics were remarkably hostile. The exhibition closed with such a loss that the artists had to disband the company they had only just formed, and each pay their share to offset the loss. Even though Cézanne sold The Hanged Man's House at the show for 300 francs, he was profoundly affected by the negative response to his work. He left for his parents' home in Aix, and stayed there all through the summer. Hortense remained alone in Paris with their son. Cézanne exhibited at only one other Impressionist show, the third, held in 1877, to which he submitted 16 paintings. But, despite all this effort, the public, although growing in numbers at these shows, remained indifferent to Impressionism. A sale at the end of the exhibition resulted in only mediocre results. From then on, Cézanne began to place more emphasis on close observation of nature, and on the rendering of light and atmospheric effects, producing works with a lighter palette and freer brushwork. He painted some 20 views of L'Estaque over the next decade, a site that has rightly been seen as contributing to Cézanne maturing as an artist. Though Cézanne was faithful to the Impressionists' rule of painting outdoors, he was never truly an Impressionist like Pissarro, Sisley or Monet. In his later works, he tried to combine the transient beauty of Impressionism with a more rigorous constructing of the painting. His works now became sharper and more intense, less raw, and more thoughtful. His strokes, unlike those of the Impressionists, were not strewn with color, but they complemented each other in a chromatic unity. This painting illustrates these techniques. Although generally a solitary man, Cézanne was friendly with the Impressionists. He and Claude Monet were good friends, and greatly admired one another's work. His fellow artists frequently commented on the clarity and elegance of Cézanne's varied subjects. Monet, as well as Degas and Gauguin, all included Cézanne's paintings in their personal collections. After the Second Impressionist exhibition in 1876, Cézanne moved away from Impressionism as a technique, although he continued to maintain friendly relations with his fellow artists. Cézanne's painting, Bathers, shows a gradually developing style and tonal scale, that gives the landscape the brilliance of a plein-air painting, and is one of his first works on the theme of bathers. Although fascinated by the nude human figure, Cézanne worked slowly, and was uncomfortable using females. "Women models frighten me," he once said. "You've got to be on the defensive all the time." On a rare occasion when he hired a female model, he panicked when she began to undress, and he pushed her, half-naked, out the door of his Paris studio. From then on, he created his nude scenes from his imagination. The rhythmic poses of the women, showing their bodies from different angles, appear, with variations, in many of Cézanne's later works. The Fisherman, painted in 1875, shares the same bright tones as Bathers, while its subject recalls the themes of fantasy Cézanne used in his earlier works. Many of Cézanne's compositions were left incomplete because of his difficulty in finalizing a painting. He took months to finish any piece, and his style made working in plein air too challenging. So, he returned to the studio and worked there instead. Cézanne continued his brighter themes in his still lifes, such as Dish of Apples, shown here. In these works, of which he painted more than 200, he ignored the laws of classical perspective, allowing each object to be independent, within the space of a picture, while the relationship of one object to another takes precedence over traditional single-point perspective. One of the advantages of still life for Cézanne was that reality could be arranged to his satisfaction, before he began painting. We know that he unobtrusively propped up some elements, such as the fruit in a dish, so that it seemed to be tilted forward. When painted, the result was optically impossible, but brought the bowl and its fruit strongly into the picture surface. In still life with jar, cup, and apples, Cézanne has rejected the intense contrasts of light and shadow of his earlier years, in exchange for a refined system of color scales, placed next to one another, and making use of more muted tones. He organized them as though they were architectural drawings, giving the most familiar objects significance and force, through the intensity of the color, and the essential simplicity of the form. This painting, Still Life with Basket, painted years later, shows how Cézanne's artistic evolution and mastery of this style, of building forms completely from color and a distorted perspective, progressed. The objects in this painting, such as the fruit and tablecloth, are rendered without use of light or shadow, but through extremely subtle gradations of color. Notice also that he has broken the line of the table edge by draping the cloth across it, then bringing the edge out from under the cloth, but no longer in line with the earlier section of the table. Here, pictorial necessity has outweighed all other considerations. Cézanne created his work slowly, building upon each previous figure with a new outline. Using this method, it took him months to finish a painting. Cézanne was unable to use real flowers in his work because they would wilt before he was able to finish. This complicated method of painting is probably why he painted the same subjects many times. In 1875, Cézanne attracted the attention of the art collector, Victor Choquet, whose commissions offered Cézanne some financial relief. Choquet collected Cézanne's paintings throughout his life, ending up with 35 at the time of his death. Choquet was the first person, and for many years, the only person, to believe that Cézanne was a genius, and that he might be greater than his contemporaries. For a self-doubting artist such as Cézanne, Choquet must have provided valuable reassurance. In gratitude, Cézanne painted Choquet's portrait, shown here, but the work attracted hilarity, outrage, and sarcasm when it was exhibited. One reviewer described the portrait as the color of an old boot. The 16 paintings Cézanne entered in the Third Impressionist exhibition in 1877 were the most severely criticized of any works displayed. Dismayed by the public's negative reaction, Cézanne isolated himself more and more in both Paris and Aix, but he continued to work diligently, periodically going back to soak up the light of southern France to recharge his flagging spirits. In 1878, Cézanne's father finally found out about Hortense after opening a letter from Victor Choquet to his son, in which Choquet sent his best wishes to Madame Cézanne and baby Paul. Angered by his son's inept lies, Cézanne's father told him that, since he pretended to be a bachelor, he would not need the usual allowance while staying with his parents. He reduced Cézanne's income, forcing him to beg for assistance from his friend Zola, who sent money to help Hortense and Paul Jr., who were living in Marseille. Later in the year, his father relented and gave his son a gift of 400 francs for his family. His father also built a studio for him at the family estate in Aix. This was on the upper floor, with an enlarged window, allowing in the northern light. From the late 1870s until the early 90s, Cézanne continued to develop his mature style. His landscapes from this period, such as the sea at L'Estaque, are regarded as his first masterpieces. These paintings have the exciting and radically new quality of simultaneously representing deep space and flat design. In these works, Cézanne rendered the perspective using only color and simple forms. Historically, European painters have relied on certain rules of perspective, which are illustrated in this photograph. The further away an object is, the smaller and less distinct it looks. Parallel lines appear to converge at the horizon. Color tones seem to fade with distance, and so on. Cézanne believed that such an approach devalued some parts of the painting. He wanted to give all objects in the painting the same strong color presence as the foreground. He tried to achieve this by techniques such as overlapping objects. If A overlaps B, then A is seen as being closer. Objects painted in warm colors, such as red, appear closer than those rendered in cool colors, like blue and green. When looking at Cézanne's paintings, we can see both a representation of depth and a flat patterned surface. The work of art becomes an autonomous object that is independent of reality. For many 20th century artists, including the Cubists, Cézanne's art became a liberating force, opening up a world of new possibilities. In the early 1880s, Cézanne and his family finally settled in Provence, where they remained from then on. The move separated Cézanne from the influence of the Paris-centered Impressionists and indicated his preference for living in the south of the country. During that time, Cézanne made this drawing that is his most beautiful facial rendering of Hortense, known as Madame Cézanne with hortensias. There is a delicacy and gentleness here, seldom seen in Cézanne's work. And then, to make it truly personal, he rendered a lovely hydrangea blossom, the hortensia, touching its leaves with delicate green washes. It was a bouquet for his wife, for the only person he could draw in the state of waking up. And he did so again, many times. In June 1880, Émile Zola, Cézanne's old school friend, who was now the art critic of the popular periodical Voltaire, published a pointed critique of the Impressionists. He attacked the group for lacking a scientific or formal rationale for their art, and for failing to anoint an acknowledged leader. At the insistence of some of his Impressionist friends, Cézanne responded to Zola on behalf of the group, swiftly painting a landscape depicting the writer's chateau at Médane. As you can see here, his work was a sweeping departure from the sketch-like views of nature that Zola had criticized. Zola's attack on Impressionism seemed to awaken something in Cézanne, a bold, systematic technique. Using ordered, parallel strokes, and a disciplined, logical approach to composition, he countered Zola's criticisms. Although, it is not really in the Impressionist style Zola was talking about. In the following years, Cézanne continued to concentrate on pictorial problems of creating depth by using layers to draw the viewer into the landscape. This technique is apparent in this painting, Viaduct of the Arc River Valley, painted in 1882. In Yardana, shown here, he painted the landscape with intense patterns of geometric rhythms, most pronounced in the houses. This style, now referred to as post-impressionism, is seen as a rejection of the Impressionists' concerns with the naturalistic rendering of light and color. Instead, the artist's emphasis was on symbolic content, formal order and structure. The post-impressionists also believed that color could be independent from form and composition, as an emotional and aesthetic bearer of meaning. This new direction in painting was led by Cézanne, but was also followed by Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh and Georges Seurat. In 1886, Émile Zola published his novel The Masterpiece. The lead character, a failed artist, was said to be based on Cézanne himself. In the book, Zola's character suffers from artistic impotence. He is depicted as a discoverer, unable to profit from his discoveries. An artist bordering on failure, although in pursuit of the highest goals. In the end, the artist hangs himself in front of the painting he cannot complete. Cézanne said little when he read the novel. But his neurotic distrust, jealousy and disappointment at Zola's writing resulted in the end of their long-standing friendship. They never spoke to each other again. Years later, in 1902, when Cézanne received the news of Zola's death, he locked himself in his studio and wept. Nevertheless, he was still bitter about the masterpiece. In 1904, he told an acquaintance that Zola had been a detestable friend, that he was totally self-centered, and that's why the masterpiece, in which he allegedly portrayed him, is nothing but a hideous distortion, a fiction he created to glorify himself. Cézanne had always been an artist plagued by doubt, by a fear of failure, by an almost paralyzing anxiety about what he was doing. He would take hours sometimes to put down a single stroke because each stroke, as he said, needed to contain the air, the light, the object, and the composition of the painting. Zola experienced this anxiety in the summer of 1861 when he showed up to sit for the portrait Cézanne was painting of him, only to learn that after many months of sittings, Cézanne had destroyed the work and was getting ready to leave town. "I tried to work on it this morning," he said, "it went from bad to worse, so I ripped it to pieces and now I'm leaving." After art reviewer, Gustave Geoffroy, treated Cézanne's work kindly in 1895, Cézanne asked if he could paint his portrait. He worked on it at Geoffroy's home for 3 months, reaching the point when only the face remained to be finished. Then, Cézanne wrote a note to the critic asking that his easel, brushes, and paints be returned, as the undertaking was beyond his strength. He had been mistaken to take it on, he said. Ambroise Vollard, Cézanne's art dealer at the end of the century, was very eager to have a Cézanne portrait of himself. Cézanne consented at once, and arranged to start at his studio for the following day. Vollard found the experience excruciating, as Cézanne's inability to complete required endless reworkings of the canvas, and ultimately resulted in spots left bare on his knuckles. Cézanne explained that he could not color them prematurely, as this might require redoing everything else in the picture. He never did fill in the blanks, and ended up content only with the way he had painted Vollard's shirt front. It was the impossibility of the task Cézanne had set for himself that accounted for his sense of failure. He called himself a slave to nature, but he knew that he could never completely capture on his canvas what he saw in nature. "Art is harmony, parallel to nature," he once said. Although Cézanne had, on several occasions, told his friends that he no longer had any romantic feelings for Hortense, in 1886, 17 years after they first met, and out of concern for Paul Jr.'s ability to legally claim an inheritance, Cézanne married the woman he called his ball and chain, and she formally became Madame Cézanne. The wedding took place in a town hall ceremony in Aix, attended by both of Cézanne's parents as witnesses, and the couple's son Paul Jr., who was already a teenager. After the proceedings, Hortense was not included in the party when Cézanne went off to lunch with the men who had been witnesses at her wedding. Instead, she accompanied Cézanne's parents to their family estate, a place where she had never been made to feel completely welcome. That year, Cézanne's father died, leaving him the family estate and an inheritance of 400,000 francs. This allowed him to paint from then on without further financial worries. He was 47 years old. In 1890, in an effort to improve his relationship with his family, Cézanne spent 5 months traveling and painting in Switzerland with Hortense and his son Paul Jr. But reconciliation appeared out of reach. On their return, Cézanne chose to continue living in Provence, while Hortense and Paul Jr. moved to Paris. Cézanne's sister, who was strongly religious, complained to him that Hortense living alone in Paris was a scandal, and demanded that Cézanne bring her back to Aix. Cézanne then reduced the allowance he was paying his wife and son, forcing Hortense to return to Provence. Cézanne set them up in separate living quarters, while he continued living with his mother and sister at the family estate. Presumably, Hortense living alone in Aix was less scandalous than Hortense living alone in Paris. In 1890, Cézanne began a series of paintings of provincial peasants playing cards. These are widely celebrated as being among his finest figure compositions, and demonstrate his system of color gradations to build form and create a three-dimensional quality in the figures. The models for the paintings were local farmhands, some of whom worked on the Cézanne family estate. Each scene is one of quiet, still concentration. The men look down at their cards, rather than at each other. A critic once described the scenes as human still life. Whereas earlier paintings of this genre, such as this one, illustrated heightened moments of drama, Cézanne's works have been noted for their lack of drama, narrative, and conventional characterization. There is no attempt in these paintings to capture the sitter's character. In most cases he treats the subject with the same care as the background, and often violently distorts facial color to bring it in harmony with the total composition. When it came to portraits, Cézanne used a similar stylistic approach to that used in his Card Players series. Some of his best-known portraits are of Hortense, as in this painting, Madame Cézanne in a red armchair. Hortense was Cézanne's favorite model. Over the course of 37 years, he painted her portrait at least 30 times, and he drew her face over and over again. He spent more time studying her form and face than that of any other human being, with the exception of his own face, captured in his self-portraits. These works clearly show the most striking aspect of his style of portraiture, his utter lack of interest in the psychology, or even in the human quality of the subject. They are the works of a man for whom people have become motifs, elements in the picture that are on a par with apples and oranges. Critics have criticized Cézanne for always making Hortense look grumpy in his paintings of her. But she had every right to be so. Cézanne was ill-tempered, paranoid, reclusive, and had an aversion to physical contact. Fits of rage isolated him from friends, and deep anxiety plagued his process. He notoriously took up to 20 minutes between brush strokes, and demanded that his subjects not speak while he was painting. There are no records of the hours Hortense put in over 3 decades of work as Cézanne's model. He called her his ball and chain, but he came back to her, over and over again. Hers was the body and face he wanted. And he wanted her sitting in a chair, hour upon hour, making not a single move. These works are the last portraits Cézanne painted of Hortense. Once the series was done, she declared an end to these endless sittings. It seems that Hortense, initially the companion, and then the wife of an artist, accepted this as her duty. It was her work, it was what she did. Now she had retired. In 1895, 27-year-old art dealer Ambroise Vollard tracked Cézanne down in Provence and convinced him to have his first one-man exhibition at his gallery in Paris, showing more than 100 of his canvases. Sales from the show were modest, only 24 works found buyers, and many of these sales were watercolors. The average price was 200 francs, although Edgar Degas paid 600 francs to take home Cézanne's lunch on the grass, shown here. Other artists also purchased paintings at the event, including Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro. Cézanne himself did not attend this landmark exhibition. Although the paintings met with some skepticism, the exhibition made the artist's name overnight. The event also started a professional relationship that would make Vollard a wealthy man, and set Cézanne on the path to becoming one of the most influential painters in the history of modern art. Delighted with the results of his Cézanne exhibition, Vollard then bought the entire contents of the artist's studio, and held 2 more exhibitions devoted to Cézanne. Matisse attended and purchased this painting, Three Bathers, his first Cézanne acquisition. Vollard handled about 2/3 of Cézanne's entire output over the course of his career, making Cézanne the first important French artist to make his reputation through a commercial gallery, rather than by way of public art exhibitions. In 1897, Cézanne's mother died, which upset him greatly as he had been very close to her. Cézanne turned to his son for support. "Life is terrifying," he would often say. Religion, which he then set about practicing for the first time, began for him because of his fear of death. "I believe in life after death," he said, "and I don't want to risk roasting in hell." He became more and more timid, mistrustful, and sensitive. His sense of loss caused him to withdraw from his wife and from his friends. He sold the family estate, losing not only his studio, but the memories of his youth. He rented an apartment in the center of town where he built a studio. It was to be his last home. In the last years of his life, Cézanne drew more and more into himself, becoming a virtual recluse. In 1899 he turned 60, but he looked 70. He was diabetic, his health was failing, especially his eyesight, and his phobias about being touched became ever more acute. His housekeeper was under firm instructions that when she passed him, she must not touch him, not even with her skirt. And he was increasingly consumed with anxieties about death. Historians believe that some of Cézanne's vision problems, such as the inability to differentiate the colors blue and green, which helped define his way of painting, came from his diabetes. When he was belatedly diagnosed with the disease, the painter was very depressed. He chose to isolate himself in nature, where he found peace of mind and painted some of his most famous works. He gradually withdrew from friends, and often made angry references to people who once gave him support. This included old colleagues, like Camille Pissarro. "I have contempt for all living painters, except Monet and Renoir," he once said. He worried that other artists would steal his secrets, especially his ideas about color, and was convinced that Paul Gauguin had done just that. Only work seemed to give him a measure of sanity and direction. From 1890 to 1905, he produced what are now considered masterpieces, one after another: 10 variations of the Mont Sainte-Victoire, 3 versions of The Boy in a Red Waistcoat, countless still-life images and, his last great achievement, the Bathers series. During this creative phase, Cézanne lived in quiet obscurity. He made no attempt to exhibit, sent nothing to the salon, and drew into an ever smaller circle of intimates that hardly extended beyond his family and servants. One of Cézanne's most persistent challenges as a painter was to master the nude figure. Bathers was a theme he followed throughout his life, culminating in 3 large canvases, executed at this time. Here he attempted to return to the classic tradition of the nude, and explore his concern for its sculptural effect. Having a phobia about using live models, He could no longer paint his nudes from anything but old drawings he made 40 years earlier in Paris, and from his imagination. In the last of the large bathers paintings, which took him 6 years to complete, he succeeded in integrating monumental nudes with a landscape, in his structural vision of reality. Toward the end of 1901, and needing to be alone, Cézanne purchased a small property located in the hills north of Aix, where he commissioned a second studio to be built. He began using it in 1903. Rising early, Cézanne would walk the mile up the hill to the studio and work there from about 6 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., return to Aix for lunch, then go back again in the afternoon to paint until 5:30 p.m. It is from near his studio that Cézanne began his systematic portrayals of what was one of his favorite subjects, and what is recognized today as his signature motif, Mont Sainte-Victoire, the dominant landform due east of Aix. It is these paintings, arguably more than any other, that display what was perhaps Cézanne's signal aesthetic tenet, the structuring power of color. Mont Sainte-Victoire appears to have had a symbolic, or even mystical character for Cézanne. The landscape, he said, becomes human, becomes a thinking, living being within me. I become one with my picture. We merge in an iridescent chaos. With a few light brushstrokes, this sick old man was able to breathe life into his Mont Sainte-Victoire paintings. He captured the same scene from many different angles, and is known to have painted it more than 60 times. Paintings like this pointed the way for later artists to employ abstract forms to evolve the language of art, to find tactile and unified means of applying paint that still captured something of the natural form. In 1902, Cézanne registered a new will, written in his own hand and identifying his son as his sole heir. Hortense was not mentioned in the will. Cézanne's love and respect for his son had grown with every passing year. All of Cézanne's contacts with Vollard, his art dealer, and any business dealing he might have in Paris, were now handled by young Paul. Both the father and the son were aware of Hortense's lack of wisdom with money, so it made sense for the son to take responsibility for his mother, and support her financially after his father's death. This is exactly what happened, and, as far as we know, mother and son remained devoted to each other until Hortense died. In his last years, Cézanne's wife and son remained in Paris. The people who were close to him were his servants, his housekeeper, and his gardener, Vallier, who became his close companion and featured in several of his paintings. Cézanne was working on one of these portraits, which remains unfinished, a few days before he died. One day, while painting outside, Cézanne was caught in a storm. He decided to go home, but on the way he collapsed. He was taken back by a passing driver. Cézanne regained consciousness, and on the following day, he wanted to continue working, but later on he fainted. He was put to bed, and never left it. He died a few days later, on the 22nd of October 1906 of pneumonia at the age of 67, and was buried at the Saint-Pierre Cemetery in his hometown of Aix-en-Provence. From Cézanne, we have learned that to alter the coloring of an object is to alter its structure. His work proves, without doubt, that painting is not the art of imitating an object by lines and colors, but of giving form to nature. In his words, a work of art is not a copy of reality, but is itself an independent reality, a created object with its own inner logic. This idea profoundly affected the development of modern art. Painters such as Edgar Degas, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Paul Gauguin, Casimir Malevich, Paul Klee, and Henri Matisse all acknowledged Cézanne's genius. Picasso referred to Cézanne as the father of us all, and referred to him as my one and only master. Praise indeed.